Hello everybody, my name is Tommy and welcome to Aero Workshop. Today I'm going to show you how I make a very simple hinge cutting jig for my router, which makes fitting hinges into doors and frames super simple and accurate every time. I've had lots of these types of templates through the years, so it's not a new idea or anything like that. I just wanted to show how quick and simple it is to make one of these jigs and how simple they are to use. And I'll also show at the end how you can actually use it in both directions, especially if you're a little bit tight for space and you haven't got room for access for the router to sit in what we call the normal way above the edge. I'm making this jig to suit this 63mm cabinet hinge, but the same principle can be used even for a bigger 100mm hinge or whatever size your hinge is. The same principle can carry through. I'm using some 18mm MDF. This is just 50mm wide, 18mm thick. Now I like using MDF because you get a clean edge once you have the cuts done. This jig is designed for a top guided flush trim bit. So the bearing is actually on the top of the cutter, not on the bottom of the cutter. And because the bearing will be running on the MDF, that's why it's nice to use MDF, because you get a clean cut for the bearing to actually follow along. To mark this out, I am just going to come up beyond the width of the hinge from the end of the piece of MDF. I'm going to hold the hinge with the knuckle up against the wood to keep it nice and square and straight. And to mark it, I like to use a utility knife because you can get really close and tight to both ends of the hinge, where if you use a pencil, you can be out by the width of the thickness of the pencil line. Once you cut it, then you end up that the cutout is actually a shade bigger than the hinge, so then you'll have a little bit of movement in the pocket for the hinge. Because I am going to be adding a piece to the underneath to clamp this and line it up with the edge of the door, that's another bit of 18mm MDF. So when I still have the hinge held in place, I'm going to hold the piece of the 18mm MDF up against the hinge, and I'm also going to scribe the back using the knife like that. And then all I need to do is just extend the two side lines into that line, and now I know that that is a tight fit to the hinge. So I'm just going to draw inside the line with the pencil. So all this is going to be removed because I think it's going to be very hard to see the score mark of the knife in the piece of wood. Now I'm going to cut this out by notching it on the table saw using the crosscut sled. You could cut this out with a jigsaw or on the bandsaw, but the cleaner you can make these cuts, the more accurate your jig is going to be. Like I said, it's going to be following, the bearing is going to be following this jig. So if there's any wavy lines in the cuts on this, the bearing is going to follow that, and that's going to transfer then into the piece that you're using and cause little gaps along the edge of your hinge or cause your hinge to be loose. Like I said, I'm going to cut this out now on the table saw using the crosscut sled, and once we've that cut out, we can worry about trimming off both ends to equal distance. Once you cut those to equal distance, it doesn't matter then whether you're at the top of a door or at the bottom of the door, you're in exactly the same amount from both sides. Okay, now that I'm at the saw, I'm just going to let the blade up till it just touches this top score line. Like that. And I'm going to use the same system as I did doing the half lap joints, where I'm going to use a stop block with a screw that's the same size as the kerf of the blade. So I'll just line that up to the first line, use the hinge itself, set that to the block, like that. And once I run that across to hit the screw, should be the exact weight of the hinge. And with that done, we just check with the hinge again to see that that is the perfect weight for the hinge. The next thing I want to do is actually cut both sides of the cutout to the same length. So I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to mark the length of the hinge onto the piece. I am then going to line that up with the cutout in the crosscut sled to where the blade is, which is there. And I am going to add a block on the fence, just clamp it in place like that. So I can now let it up, cut this side, flip it over, cut the other side, and the two of those are going to be exactly the same offset from the cutout for the hinge. Okay, with that now cut, and I also cut the little piece that I'm going to screw to the bottom, it's only a matter of screwing both of those together just like that. So you keep this piece out to the edge of the cutout. So just going to bore that and screw it together now. Now, when you're putting this together, it's important that you keep it perfectly flush on the face edge and at the ends, if at all possible. It's not as important on the ends, but if you can, it's important to try and do it. So, with those done and lined up, just 2 screws. I'm not going to bother with glue, just in case I need to take it apart again at a later stage for different uses, or if I need to at some stage replace this piece here in the future. And you'll see why when I start explaining how we set this up and how we set the depth to use for both uses of this jig. Okay, the next process is setting up the router to use with the jig. Now, the first thing I need to do is just set what I'd class as the 0 depth. So I just let the bit down till it touches the jig and then lock it in place. And now that will actually just barely touch the jig, but actually remove no material. That would be what I call 0 depth. Now, as you can see, this cutter is a shallow cutter, which allows the bearing to run on the jig. You want to be careful that you don't have too long a cutter, because then what will happen is the bearing won't actually be running on the jig. So this is a 12mm cutting edge on this, and for the later process we will want a slightly longer one, but it's important that you make sure that if you're getting a cutter, that you get one that the bearing will still run on the material of the jig. Now what I like to do to set the thickness of cut for the hinge is using the dip stop on the router. I just let it down so that the thickness of the hinge is between the stop, like that, and I just tighten that up, so that will give me the thickness of the hinge as a depth of cut. So like I said, this is set to 0, I have the thickness of the hinge, and once I plunge down that, it should be the right thickness for the hinge. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run a very small cut out of this portion of the jig, and then I can check by putting the hinge in like that that it's the correct depth. It's very important not to go too deep with this cut initially. It's better to creep up to the depth you want than actually remove too much material. If you remove too much material out of this section of the jig when you're setting up, you won't be able to use this jig for the second operational cut. You also won't be able to use that depth of cut to set the router up in future, because once you've this cut, you can just every time offer that up to the router like that and set the depth of cut for your hinge. Okay, I have a little piece clamped to the bench just to represent the style of a door. So you just get your jig, you can hold it at the end the same as you would on the door, and just put a clamp on it from back to front, like that. Just make sure that your clamp is down below the depth that you're going to be cutting, so you won't hit the clamp and damage your cutter. So with that in place, I'm just going to do my test cut to check the depth is correct for the hinge. And offer that in, and that's actually perfect first time. But that's because I was able to set the plunge depth with the stop on the router. If I didn't have a depth stop on the router, I would have to do a little bit more to finesse the depth. Now, I'm going to cut this out. Now, I'm going to run the router kind of a little bit odd. I'm going to go a climb cut here first. I'm going to run a couple of climb cuts back this way, and then I'm going to run in the normal direction. That's just purely to minimise the tear out in the wood, because if you just run in, run across and run out, you might have a small little bit of tear out in the corner of the door where it meets the jig. Now, because the jig is a tight fit to it, it should minimise that, but I always find by doing a climb cut there first, you really minimise the opportunity for that to happen. And that's it cut out. Now, what I like to do before I remove the jig is just get a sharp chisel and use the jig to square up the chisel just to remove the material that's left in both corners from the radius of the bit. And now with those clean out, we can remove the jig, and now we can offer the hinge up to see how it fits. And as you can see, it's perfectly flush with the edge, and it's the correct depth, and we have no gaps anywhere around the hinge. So that's one very well fitted hinge with just a quick run of the router. Okay, now that we have the hinge jig done and we have cut on the edge of the door, let's say we want to cut it to the edge of the frame to hang the door into a framed cabinet. But let's just assume that the door on the cabinet, let's say, is 200 millimeters wide. So you can only have a router that's 200 millimeters to fit into that frame, to machine to the edge of the frame to recess the hinge. So you can't fit the router in. So the only way you can actually do it is actually from the face of the frame. Now, this jig can still cut that hinge, and I'll show you how now. For this, I have changed out my 12 millimeter cutting length bit to a 20 millimeter cutting length bit. Now, this is why it was important to actually make this cut the correct depth, because for this cut, that is what the bearing is going to be running on. It's going to be running on this edge, not these three edges here. So if you had made that too deep, once you go to do this type of cut, you would actually be sinking the hinge deeper into the frame than what you need. So the same as the last time, we can now use the jig in this direction to set the depth of cut to just shy of this line here. And as you can see, the bearing has plenty of contact on the jig. So like the last time, you still place the jig in the same orientation as it was previously. So you hold it to the edge and you put the cutout that we had done originally to the edge. Now, the only difference is we're clamping it in a different area. So we're going to clamp it here, like that. And now I'm going to have the router on the top instead of on the edge. Now, I am going to do this again as a climb cut. So I'm actually going to run it in the opposite direction than we normally would. And that's just to try and minimize any tear out in the bottom of the cut and at the start of the cut. And the same as before, I'm going to use the jig to square the chisel in to clean out both ends. And there you go, a hinge fitted in from the face of the frame into the edge, using the very same jig, just with a different bit and from the opposite direction. Now this is a single hinge jig, so it'll cut one hinge at a time. But you can use the very same principle and add to that and do like I done. And I made this jig, which makes it in the way you can actually position 3 hinges at the one time for internal doors. So there's plenty of ways you can adapt this. Like I said, you can make it for different sized hinges. You can actually set it in the way that it spaces the hinges if you have a batch of doors to do, or you can keep it singly to do the odd door every now and again. So I hope this video was useful and I hope you actually enjoyed looking at it. If you did, maybe you might consider giving it a thumbs up. So all that's left for me to say is thanks very much for watching. See you again soon. Good luck.